Bоже moi, I'll never forget the morning of December 15, 1942, standing on the west bank of the Volga River, watching an endless column of American Studebaker trucks stretch from the ferry landing to the horizon, carrying ammunition, fuel, and food that would allow the Red Army to continue fighting in the ruins of Stalingrad when our own supply lines had been cut by German forces for over a month. The Russian winter was brutal as always, with temperatures dropping to -30 degrees, but the sound of American truck engines starting in the cold was like music from heaven, and from somewhere in the convoy, I could hear a Soviet radio playing Katyusha, mixing Russian patriotism with American mechanical reliability in ways I'd never imagined possible. I was Major Ivan Iron Will Petrov, 1st Guards Tank Army Red Army, and after 2 years of fighting from the suburbs of Moscow to the factory districts of Stalingrad, I thought I understood everything about armored warfare, about Soviet industrial might, about the superiority of socialist production over capitalist inefficiency. My nickname came from my reputation for never retreating, never accepting defeat, never allowing German forces to advance through positions defended by my T-34 tank battalion, regardless of odds or casualties. But what I witnessed during those crucial weeks at Stalingrad would challenge everything I'd been taught about American capitalism, everything I believed about Soviet self-sufficiency, and everything I thought I knew about the mathematics of industrial warfare. Those American trucks would teach me that we weren't just fighting German fascists with Soviet tanks and courage. We were fighting with American steel and gasoline and rubber, delivered by American ships that crossed oceans under enemy attack to bring us the tools of victory that Soviet factories couldn't produce fast enough to save the city that bore Stalin's name. My education in American industrial support began reluctantly in September 1942, when political officers started explaining the Lend-Lease program that supposedly provided Western aid for the Great Patriotic War against fascist Germany. According to party doctrine, Soviet industry was superior to capitalist production. Soviet workers were more dedicated than American workers, and Soviet technology was more advanced than anything produced by profit-obsessed American corporations. "Comrades," announced Colonel Dmitry Volkov during one of our weekly political education meetings, "the American capitalists are providing some military equipment through the Lend-Lease program, but this represents a small supplement to Soviet production, rather than significant assistance for our war effort." His explanation emphasized that American aid was motivated by capitalist self-interest rather than genuine support for socialism, that American equipment was inferior to Soviet weapons systems, and that relying on Western assistance would weaken Soviet revolutionary resolve and compromise our ideological purity. "Remember, comrades, that American trucks and radios cannot replace Soviet tanks and artillery," Colonel Volkov continued. "We fight with superior Soviet equipment produced by heroic Soviet workers who understand the importance of defending socialism against fascist aggression." This propaganda seemed credible because most American equipment I'd encountered was limited to jeeps, radios, and other minor items that represented convenient additions rather than essential components of Soviet military capability. Our T-34 tanks were built in Soviet factories, our Katyusha rocket launchers were designed by Soviet engineers, and our artillery pieces were manufactured by Soviet workers who understood the revolutionary importance of defeating German imperialism. But my skepticism about American aid began to change during the German offensive toward Stalingrad in August 1942, when Soviet supply lines were stretched beyond capacity and American equipment started appearing in quantities that exceeded anything I'd previously observed. "Comrade Major," reported Senior Sergeant Alexei Volgin, my battalion supply officer, "we are receiving American fuel, American ammunition, and American rations in addition to Soviet supplies. American gasoline burns cleaner than Soviet fuel, American explosives are more reliable than some Soviet shells, and American canned meat tastes better than anything our field kitchens can prepare." His observations were tactically valuable, but ideologically problematic, because they suggested that American products might actually be superior to Soviet equivalents in some practical categories. However, I attributed this to temporary wartime expedience rather than systematic American advantages over socialist production methods. The reality of American industrial support became undeniable during the German attack on Stalingrad itself. when Soviet defensive positions depended increasingly on American trucks for ammunition delivery, American radios for tactical coordination, and American medical supplies for treating wounded defenders. Major Petrov, observed Captain Boris Kuznetsov, commander of our artillery battery, American radio equipment provides clearer communication than Soviet radios, American trucks can carry heavier loads than Soviet vehicles, and American field telephones work more reliably under combat conditions. These performance advantages were significant enough to affect tactical operations, but I tried to maintain ideological orthodoxy by explaining that American equipment advantages were temporary results of capitalist resource allocation rather than systematic superiority over Soviet technology. "Comrade Captain," I replied, "American equipment may perform adequately under current conditions, but Soviet industry will soon produce superior weapon systems that demonstrate the advantages of socialist planning over capitalist chaos." But as German forces encircled Stalingrad in September 1942 and began systematic destruction of Soviet supply lines, American equipment became essential rather than supplemental for continued resistance. Without American trucks carrying ammunition across the Volga, without American radios coordinating defensive positions, without American medical supplies treating wounded soldiers, Soviet forces couldn't have maintained effective resistance against German attacks. The mathematical reality of American aid became apparent when I was assigned to coordinate supply operations for our sector of the Stalingrad defense, providing detailed knowledge of logistics requirements and equipment availability that revealed the true scope of Western assistance. Major Petrov, explained Lieutenant Colonel Sergei Petrov, Division Logistics Officer, American Lend-Lease provides approximately 40% of our vehicles, 30% of our fuel, 50% of our communications equipment, and 20% of our ammunition. Without American supplies, we cannot maintain current defensive operations. 40% of our vehicles meant that nearly half of Soviet military transportation depended on American trucks rather than Soviet production. This wasn't minor supplemental assistance. This was systematic dependence on American industrial capacity for basic military logistics. "Lieutenant Colonel," I asked, "are these numbers accurate? Does Soviet logistics really depend so heavily on American equipment?" "Comrade Major," he replied with the careful precision of an officer who understood both military reality and political sensitivity, "American Lend-Lease provides essential support that allows Soviet industry to focus on tanks and artillery while American factories supply vehicles and communications equipment. This represents efficient division of labor rather than Soviet weakness." His explanation maintained ideological correctness while acknowledging practical dependence on American aid that exceeded anything described in political education materials or Soviet propaganda about self-sufficient socialist production. But the full scope of American aid became visible only during the crisis period of late December 1942, when German forces had cut most Soviet supply routes and threatened to capture the remaining ferry crossings that connected Stalingrad defenders with reinforcements and supplies from the east bank of the Volga. "All units prepare for final defensive operations," ordered General Vasily Chuikov during our last division commanders meeting before the German winter offensive. "Supply lines are severed, ammunition reserves are critically low, and reinforcements are unavailable. We will hold Stalingrad with whatever resources remain available." The situation seemed hopeless by Soviet standards. Surrounded forces with limited ammunition, inadequate medical supplies, and minimal food reserves, attempting to resist German attacks that were supported by superior artillery and air power. Under normal circumstances, such conditions would require either immediate reinforcement or tactical withdrawal to more defensible positions. Instead, on December 15, 1942, I witnessed the arrival of the largest American supply convoy I'd ever seen, hundreds of Studebaker trucks carrying everything needed to continue resistance operations, plus reserves for potential counter-offensive operations. The convoy had traveled from Murmansk along routes that were under constant German air attack, through weather conditions that destroyed Soviet vehicles regularly, carrying supplies that included not just ammunition and fuel, but American radios, American medical equipment, American winter clothing, and American food that exceeded Soviet military ration standards. "Bоже mой," whispered Captain Kuznetsov, as we watched American trucks unload supplies that filled every available warehouse and storage facility in our sector. There are more supplies in this single convoy than our regiment received during the entire month of November. He was right. American trucks were delivering ammunition in quantities that exceeded Soviet artillery production for several weeks, fuel reserves that could support armored operations for extended periods, and communications equipment that provided every battalion with reliable radio contact for coordinated defensive operations. But what impressed me most wasn't just the quantity of American supplies, but the quality of equipment that exceeded Soviet manufacturing standards in most technical categories. American Studebaker trucks started reliably in sub-zero temperatures that disabled Soviet vehicles, carried heavier loads than Soviet trucks could handle, and required less maintenance than equipment produced by Soviet factories. American radios provided clearer communication over longer distances than Soviet communications equipment could achieve. These American trucks, observed Senior Sergeant Volgin, are built to higher mechanical standards than Soviet vehicles. American engines run smoother, American transmissions shift easier, and American electrical systems work more reliably under combat conditions. His technical assessment was accurate, but ideologically troubling, because it suggested that capitalist production methods might actually be superior to socialist manufacturing techniques in practical military applications. The strategic importance of American aid became undeniable when Soviet forces began their counteroffensive operations in January 1943, using American trucks to transport troops and supplies for Operation Little Saturn that would encircle German forces and relieve the siege of Stalingrad. "Comrade Major," explained Colonel Volkov during planning for the counteroffensive, "American Lend-Lease has provided the Red Army with over 300,000 vehicles since the program began, including 150,000 trucks that form the backbone of Soviet military logistics throughout the Eastern Front. 300,000 vehicles represented more transportation capacity than Soviet industry had produced during the entire pre-war period, while 150,000 trucks exceeded total Soviet military vehicle production since the German invasion began in June 1941. Without American vehicles, Colonel Volkov continued, the Red Army could not maintain supply lines across the vast distances of the Eastern Front, could not transport troops rapidly between threatened sectors, and could not support the mobile operations necessary for strategic counter-offensives. This admission represented fundamental revision of earlier propaganda about Soviet self-sufficiency and minimal importance of American aid. We weren't just receiving supplemental assistance from Western allies. We were dependent on American industrial production for basic military capabilities that Soviet factories couldn't provide. But beyond vehicles, American Lend-Lease was providing other essential military supplies that Soviet industry couldn't produce in sufficient quantities to maintain effective resistance against German forces. American Lend-Lease, Colonel Volkov explained, includes not just trucks and jeeps, but also radios, telephone wire, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, food, and raw materials that Soviet factories used to produce tanks and artillery. The scope of American aid exceeded my previous understanding and included basic industrial materials that Soviet production required for manufacturing weapons systems. We weren't just using American finished products, we were using American steel and aluminum and rubber to build Soviet tanks and aircraft. During the successful Soviet counteroffensive that encircled German forces and lifted the siege of Stalingrad, American equipment played crucial roles that made the difference between victory and defeat in operations that determined the outcome of the entire war. American trucks transported Soviet troops to attack positions faster than German forces could respond. American radios coordinated complex multi-division operations with precision that exceeded anything Soviet communications had achieved previously, and American supplies sustained offensive operations for weeks without the logistical failures that had characterized earlier Soviet attacks. "Major Petrov," observed General Chvikov after the successful completion of Operation Little Saturn, "American Lend-Lease has provided the Red Army with logistics capabilities that make strategic offensive operations possible on scales that Soviet industry alone could not support." His assessment acknowledged that Soviet military success depended on American industrial aid in ways that contradicted official propaganda about socialist self-sufficiency and superiority over capitalist production methods. Without American trucks, General Chuikov continued, we could not have transported reinforcements rapidly enough to prevent German forces from capturing Stalingrad. Without American ammunition and fuel, we could not have sustained defensive operations during the siege. Without American radios and medical supplies, we could not have coordinated the counteroffensive that encircled German forces. This recognition of American contributions to Soviet victory represented significant evolution in my understanding of industrial warfare and the relationship between ideology and military reality. Soviet courage and tactical skill were essential for defeating German forces, but they were insufficient without American industrial support that provided the tools of victory. My education in American industrial capabilities continued during 1943 as Soviet forces advanced westward, using logistics systems that depended increasingly on American equipment and supplies delivered through convoy routes that demonstrated American naval power and commercial capability. Comrade Major, explained Major General Andrei Vlasov during a logistics conference in Moscow, American Lend-Lease deliveries include over 400,000 vehicles, 12,000 armored vehicles, 11,000 aircraft, and millions of tons of fuel, ammunition, and raw materials that enable continued Soviet offensive operations. These numbers exceeded total Soviet military production in most categories and represented systematic American support that made possible the sustained offensive operations that would drive German forces back to Berlin. But perhaps most significantly, I learned that American aid included not just military equipment, but also technological knowledge and industrial techniques that improved Soviet production capabilities while demonstrating American commitment to anti-fascist coalition that transcended ideological differences. American engineers, Major General Vlasov continued, are providing technical assistance for Soviet aircraft production, tank manufacturing, and communications equipment that incorporates American innovations with Soviet design requirements. This technological cooperation represented unprecedented sharing of industrial knowledge between capitalist and socialist systems, demonstrating that practical military necessity could override ideological prejudices when survival was at stake. The full scope of American commitment to Soviet victory became apparent when I learned about convoy operations that delivered Lend-Lease supplies through Arctic routes that were under constant German attack, representing American willingness to risk ships and sailors for Soviet military success. American merchant marines, explained Captain Nikolai Kuznetsov, Soviet naval liaison officer, sail through German submarine patrols and air attacks to deliver Lend-Lease supplies to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. Many American sailors have died bringing supplies that enable continued Soviet resistance against fascist aggression. American merchant marine casualties represented sacrifice for Soviet military capabilities that exceeded what any capitalist ally could be expected to provide for socialist cause. But Americans were risking their lives to ensure Soviet survival, demonstrating commitment to anti-fascist coalition that transcended economic and political differences. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Soviet forces were equipped with American vehicles, supplied with American fuel, coordinated through American radios, and supported by logistics systems that depended fundamentally on American industrial production, delivered by American sailors who'd risked their lives for Soviet victory. Comrade Major, said Marshal Georgy Zhukov during the victory parade in Moscow, Soviet forces have achieved decisive victory over German fascism through superior socialist military doctrine combined with material assistance from our American allies who demonstrated that capitalist production can serve anti-fascist purposes when properly motivated. His assessment acknowledged American contributions while maintaining ideological framework that preserved Soviet pride and political orthodoxy. But privately, most Soviet officers understood that victory would have been impossible without systematic American aid that exceeded Soviet industrial capabilities. My post-war career in Soviet armored forces included assignments that provided continued exposure to American military technology and industrial methods that influenced Soviet development while maintaining political correctness about socialist superiority over capitalist systems. American automotive technology, I explained to Soviet tank designers, demonstrates manufacturing techniques and quality control methods that could improve Soviet vehicle production while maintaining socialist principles and revolutionary consciousness. This approach allowed incorporation of American innovations without acknowledging systematic American advantages over Soviet industrial methods or challenging official doctrine about socialist superiority. But my correspondence with American officers began during the 1950s, providing opportunities to express gratitude for Lend-Lease assistance while exploring possibilities for continued cooperation that transcended Cold War political tensions. Major Petrov, wrote Colonel Robert Patterson, former Lend-Lease administration officer, Soviet forces fought with tremendous courage and skill against German aggression, and American industrial support was honored to contribute to anti-fascist victory that preserved democratic values worldwide. His letters emphasized shared commitment to defeating fascism, while acknowledging that post-war political differences shouldn't erase wartime cooperation that had served mutual interests in preserving civilization against totalitarian aggression. In 1965, 20 years after the war ended, I was permitted to visit the United States as part of limited cultural exchange during the Khrushchev thaw, providing opportunities to observe American industrial capabilities that had produced Lend-Lease supplies and continue to operate at levels exceeding Soviet achievements. "Colonel Petrov," said General Patterson, the former colonel who now commanded American logistics operations, "American industrial capacity has continued to expand since the war ended, but we're proud that our production capabilities contributed to Soviet victory against German fascism." During that 1965 visit, I toured American factories, automobile plants, and logistics facilities that demonstrated continued innovation and efficiency improvements that built upon wartime production achievements while serving peaceful rather than military purposes. But perhaps most importantly, I learned that American workers and engineers who'd produced Lend-Lease equipment maintained pride in their contributions to Soviet victory and hoped that former allies could cooperate in addressing global challenges that required international rather than national solutions. "The trucks and radios we built for the Red Army," explained the plant manager at the Studebaker factory in Indiana, "helped defeat fascism and preserve freedom for people worldwide. We hope that American and Soviet workers can continue cooperating for peaceful purposes that serve humanity rather than political competition." This sentiment was echoed by American veterans, engineers, and workers who'd contributed to Lend-Lease production and maintained respect for Soviet sacrifice, while hoping for improved relationships between former allies who demonstrated ability to cooperate when survival was at stake. My final assessment of American Lend-Lease assistance, written in 1975 shortly before my retirement, acknowledged both the military contribution and its implications for understanding industrial warfare and international cooperation. The 10,000 American trucks that helped save Stalingrad represented not just material assistance, but evidence that capitalist and socialist systems could cooperate effectively when their survival was threatened by common enemies. This was my story, Major Ivan Iron Will Petrov, who learned that Soviet victory depended not just on revolutionary courage and socialist determination, but on American trucks and fuel and ammunition delivered by American sailors who risked their lives for Soviet survival, and that industrial warfare required international cooperation that transcended ideological differences when civilization itself was threatened. My experience with American Lend-Lease taught me that dismissing capitalist contributions to socialist victory was foolish pride that ignored mathematical realities of modern warfare, that American industrial capacity served anti-fascist purposes with efficiency that exceeded Soviet capabilities, and that former allies could remember wartime cooperation even during periods of political tension and ideological competition. What struck you most about my recognition that American trucks saved Stalingrad? Have you heard similar accounts from veterans who witnessed the crucial role of Lend-Lease assistance in Soviet military operations? These personal testimonies help us understand how individual observations could challenge ideological assumptions and reveal the importance of international cooperation in defeating fascist aggression. If you want to hear more first-hand accounts like this one, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Tomorrow, we'll be sharing the story of Sergeant Major Chen Wei-ming, a Chinese nationalist soldier who witnessed American air support operations in Burma and learned how Allied cooperation could overcome seemingly impossible odds. These voices from the past deserve to be heard. Let's make sure their stories live on.